He was already living with ghosts long before he wore all those stars on his collar. Decades after the last rifle volleys had faded, someone discovered a note in the archives that revealed a moment of rare self-doubt. It was a single page from an old diary he kept in the Philippines, written during the darkest hours of World War II, when surrender seemed inevitable and men were dying by the thousands on Bataan. There, in his own hand, he asked himself if he had truly done enough. He wondered if, in all the battles he had fought, he had held back any measure of his will or skill that might have saved some of those poor souls. It's jarring to read, because from the outside, he always seemed so certain, so absolutely convinced of his own destiny. Yet here he was, alone under flickering lamplight, lamenting the very essence of command. You can strategize perfectly, give everything you have, and still lose soldiers whose names you'll never forget. That page gives us an opening into the complicated world of General Douglas MacArthur, one of America's most polarizing and legendary military leaders. His story is not just about medals and triumphal returns. It's a journey through the moral fog of wars that shook the world and through the very personal battles he fought behind that unyielding facade. He was born in 1880 into a family intimately bound to America's earliest expansions and conflicts. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a seasoned officer who had tasted Civil War gunpowder and carried scars from the assault on Missionary Ridge. The MacArthur name already had deep associations with bravery, tradition, and a certain flamboyant sense of honor. Douglas grew up in a post-Civil War era when the nation was trying to reinvent itself. Industrial growth was booming, and the frontier spirit was still alive, but the country was also reckoning with the memory of brother fighting brother. Into this environment of national self-discovery came the child who would be shaped by both the stories of his father's heroics and the formidable presence of his mother, Mary Pinky Hardy MacArthur. By the turn of the century, the stage was set for more conflicts as America found itself increasingly involved on the global stage. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States began to project power overseas, establishing colonies or protectorates in places like the Philippines. Tensions between major powers were building in Europe, laying the foundation for World War I. This was the crucible in which the young Douglas MacArthur came of age. The world into which he was commissioned would be torn by industrial-scale warfare, first in France, then across Asia and the Pacific, and later in the Korean Peninsula. Every shred of tradition he carried from home would be tested by the brutality of a new kind of global conflict, the likes of which humanity had never before seen. He arrived at West Point in 1899, carrying not just a trunk and books, but also the expectations of a revered military lineage. His father was already a legend, having been one of the youngest generals in the Civil War. His mother was so determined that Douglas succeed, she moved to a hotel near West Point to keep a vigilant eye on her son's progress. By some accounts, she even kept tabs on his demerits and achievements, forging an intense relationship that blended maternal devotion with an almost relentless ambition. It was said that if you looked out a dorm window, you might spot her silhouette, a solitary figure scanning the ranks to ensure her son carried himself with the dignity she expected. This suffocating presence might have driven many cadets to rebellion, but for Douglas, it became a source of inner steel. He graduated at the top of his class in 1903, the star pupil of an institution that prized discipline, tradition, and the cultivation of leadership qualities. Those who knew him then would later recall that he seldom seemed like a teenager at all, more like a fully formed officer in waiting, with a purposeful stride and a mind that never ceased thinking about the next move. He was assigned to various posts early in his career: sometimes in obscure corners of the expanding American empire. One little-known assignment took him to the Far East even before the cataclysms of the mid-20th century. In those formative years, he displayed both brilliance and a knack for rubbing senior officers the wrong way. He had an intense self-confidence bordering on arrogance that made subordinates admire him and superiors wary. By the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, MacArthur was already recognized as an energetic, innovative officer. He helped form the 42nd Rainbow Division, a title he is credited with suggesting. The division's name aimed to represent a broad sweep of American states, as though forging a rainbow of unity in the newly minted National Army. On the battlefields of France, MacArthur's fame took shape. He frequently led from the front, exposing himself to sniper fire and artillery barrages that sent many of his comrades diving for cover. He even complained at one point that all his uniforms were peppered with bullet holes. It wasn't a boast so much as a statement of fact. He really did put himself in harm's way that often, believing that a commander must share the hardships of his men. His leadership was recognized with multiple awards, and some said he was recommended for the Medal of Honor more than once during that war. He didn't receive it then, but seeds were planted for his future legend. Shortly after the armistice in the early 1920s, he found himself back at West Point, this time as the Academy's superintendent. He was the youngest man ever to hold that post. By then, the world had changed drastically. The horrors of trench warfare had left a cynicism about old strategies. Many believed that modern technology, planes, tanks, machine guns, had transformed the entire nature of conflict, and the next war, if it came, would require more agile minds. MacArthur pushed for curriculum changes that stressed modern flexible thinking. He believed in building intellectual warriors who understood the new dimensions of warfare, not just men who could recite ancient tactics by rote. Some older colleagues resisted, uncomfortable with his disruptions to tradition. He pressed on, unwavering, an approach that became a hallmark of his career. He never shied from ruffling the feathers of the establishment if he believed himself correct. Yet throughout these successes, personal losses and heartbreaks were taking their toll. While stationed in Washington, D.C., MacArthur married a wealthy socialite, Louise Cromwell Brooks, but their union was brief and troubled. She found his dedication to duty overwhelming. He found her world of soirees and social intrigues trivial. The tension was compounded by the watchful eye of his mother, Mary, who was deeply intertwined in his private life. Eventually, the marriage ended. It was a painful chapter overshadowed by more public duties, and though MacArthur rarely discussed personal matters, those who were close to him recognized it as a wound. Behind the polished medals and the upright posture was a man struggling to reconcile the uniform's demands with a private longing for stability and intimacy. In the 1930s, he rose to become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army under President Herbert Hoover, a role that thrust him into the national spotlight. America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and the military was underfunded, overshadowed by urgent economic concerns. Then came the Bonus Army incident in 1932, one of the darkest marks on MacArthur's pre-World War II record. Thousands of World War I veterans, desperate for promised bonuses that Congress had delayed, marched on Washington, setting up makeshift camps. MacArthur was ordered to help remove these protesters if they failed to disperse. The final assault by cavalry and tear gas, with MacArthur at the helm, caused widespread outrage. Images of U.S. soldiers turning on their own veterans played across newspapers nationwide. MacArthur believed he was upholding law and order, but critics saw a heavy-handed approach. Even the president was reportedly disturbed by the severity of the crackdown. This foreshadowed one of the key traits of MacArthur's career, a certain certainty in his own judgment that sometimes led him to take extreme measures. Consequences be damned. By the mid-1930s, events in Europe and Asia were once again threatening global peace. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and Japan was pursuing an aggressive expansion in Asia, occupying Manchuria and eyeing Southeast Asia. MacArthur left the post of Chief of Staff and took on a mission in the Philippines, tasked with helping build up the island nation's defenses. He'd spent time there in his youth, and it held personal meaning for him. When he formally retired from the U.S. Army in 1937, he was appointed Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, a curious rank, unique in history, that illustrated his special relationship with that emerging nation. He married Jean Faircloth, his second wife, and found a measure of personal happiness after a long period of solitude. Their son, Arthur MacArthur IV, was born in 1938. It seemed for a moment that MacArthur might live out the rest of his days in relative peace, guiding the Philippine military and spending time with family. But the specter of war loomed, and his story was far from over. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Philippines was attacked within hours. Caught off guard, MacArthur's forces were quickly overwhelmed. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942 was a devastating blow, and President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia rather than stay and risk capture. From the deck of a PT boat whisking him away into the darkness, he uttered the words that would become immortal: "I shall return." These were not just theatrical flair. They were a promise that fueled the morale of Filipinos left behind to endure some of the worst atrocities of the war, including the Bataan Death March. That promise also weighed heavily on MacArthur himself, who saw it as a binding oath. He threw himself into reorganizing the Allied war effort in the Southwest Pacific, forging a strategy that often bypassed heavily fortified Japanese bases in favor of weaker targets, an approach that saved countless Allied lives, though it also fueled tension with other Allied commanders, who favored a more direct confrontation. During those turbulent years, stories emerged of MacArthur's tireless routines. He was said to work 16 or 18 hours a day, surviving on coffee and cigarettes. He'd hold late-night strategy sessions, sometimes still wearing a dressing gown, poring over maps illuminated by dim lamps, plotting island-hopping campaigns that would inch the Allies closer to Japan. Despite tensions with other generals, including Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led much of the Pacific naval operations, MacArthur held firmly to his conviction that the liberation of the Philippines was crucial. Some in Washington argued for focusing on direct assaults on Japan's outer defenses, but MacArthur insisted that American honor and the strategic significance of the Philippines demanded a return. In October 1944, he stood on the beach in Leyte Gulf, fulfilling his famous pledge, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Cameras captured the moment as he waded ashore, water splashing around his well-known figure. It was a piece of wartime theater, as well as a legitimate triumph. For Filipinos who had suffered under brutal occupation, MacArthur's return symbolized hope and retribution. Behind the scenes, he was never entirely free from self-doubt or regret. Letters from soldiers under his command revealed that he took personal interest in casualties, often scribbling notes in the margins of reports about wounded or missing personnel. One letter from a grieving widow reached him in early 1945, accusing him of sacrificing men for personal glory. According to a staff officer who saw MacArthur open it, he closed his office door and read it in silence for nearly an hour, rereading every line. He was spotted later standing by a window with tears in his eyes. Whether he believed the widow's accusations or saw them as unfair is anyone's guess, but it's an example of how the burdens of command weighed on a man who publicly carried himself with stoic resolve. By the war's end, in 1945, MacArthur was a five-star general and arguably one of the most famous Allied commanders. The Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, was orchestrated largely by him. His address was short but pointed, mentioning that the utter destructiveness of war now blots out this alternative, and cautioning that we have had our last chance. Many found it an ironic statement, given his own inclination for decisive military action, but it did hint at the horrors he'd witnessed. More than most, he understood that the age of atomic weapons demanded a new kind of global caution. Then came perhaps one of the most extraordinary chapters of his life, the occupation of Japan. From 1945 to 1951, MacArthur effectively governed a defeated nation of nearly 80 million people. He oversaw everything from disbanding the military to rewriting the Constitution, ensuring democratic reforms, and introducing land reform that broke the feudal hold of large landowners. His headquarters in the Daiichi building in Tokyo became the nerve center of this massive transformation. He insisted that the Emperor Hirohito remain on the throne as a symbolic figure to maintain social stability. Many in the West found this approach curious or even too lenient, but MacArthur believed that punishing or humiliating the emperor might ignite rebellion among the Japanese population. In those critical years, MacArthur shaped Japan's future far more than any other single individual. He was revered by many Japanese, even as some Americans grumbled that he was too much the benevolent overlord. A famous photograph of Emperor Hirohito standing next to MacArthur in a simple suit while the general wore an open-collar shirt symbolized the massive shift underway. A proud deity-like figure to the Japanese stood overshadowed by this tall American, effectively demonstrating the new power dynamic. While he managed these colossal tasks in Japan, global tension shifted toward the Cold War. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the Korean War began. MacArthur was placed in command of the United Nations forces, and his bold landing at Incheon in September 1950 is often cited as one of the great strategic strokes of the modern era. It caught the North Koreans off guard, forced them into a rapid retreat, and briefly suggested that the war might be won quickly. Few doubted MacArthur's capacity for daring maneuvers. However, as his forces pressed north, close to the Chinese border, the People's Republic of China intervened with a massive influx of troops. American and UN forces were pushed back, suffering heavy losses and harsh winter conditions. Here, once again, that unyielding MacArthur personality came into conflict with higher authority. He wanted to expand the war into Chinese territory, possibly even use atomic weapons to prevent another stalemate. President Harry Truman, fearing a broader conflict with the Soviet Union, refused. The standoff escalated into a battle of wills. MacArthur openly criticized the administration's policies, sending messages to Congress that contradicted the president's strategy. Truman decided enough was enough. On April 11, 1951, he relieved MacArthur of his command, a move that shocked many Americans and triggered an outpouring of anger and support in equal measure. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome in some quarters and faced condemnation in others. His farewell address to Congress included the famous line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The broadcast captured the bittersweet essence of a man who had fought in 3 major conflicts, shaped the destiny of nations, and had the unwavering loyalty of countless veterans. In private, MacArthur was devastated. He had devoted almost every waking hour of his adult life to military service. And suddenly, he was a general without an army. He briefly considered a run for the presidency, but ultimately decided against it. He took on roles in the private sector, advising corporations, delivering speeches, but in his heart, he was still that soldier on the field, checking the angles, seeing the next move, always seeking to command. Over the years, he penned memoirs and occasionally engaged with critics and admirers. The controversies didn't fade either. Some said his reckless push toward the Chinese border in Korea prolonged the war and led to unnecessary casualties. Others revered him as the only man bold enough to stand up to the political timidity of Washington. The arguments continue to this day, with historians divided over whether MacArthur's strategic instincts in Korea might have led to an even greater catastrophe if fully unleashed, or whether they could have won the war decisively before communism dug in so firmly in the North. Yet behind all the public discourse was a man shaped by deep convictions, possibly illusions, of his own destiny. At times he spoke as if he were fated to lead armies in epic struggles. He was known to read the Bible nightly, highlighting passages on leadership and divine providence. During the earliest days of the Korean War, when things looked hopeless, he reportedly quoted from Psalm 91 to his staff, "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge." Such convictions might have been a source of strength, but they also created a moral framework in which MacArthur saw his own role as almost preordained, leaving little room for compromise or acknowledging mistakes. He spent his final years in New York, living in the penthouse suite of the Waldorf Astoria. There he would greet guests surrounded by mementos of his career: Japanese swords surrendered by enemy officers, photographs of him in uniform, flags and medals arrayed in showcases. Occasionally, a visitor might glimpse a more introspective side of him, especially if the conversation turned to the men he had lost. There's a story told by his biographer that MacArthur once pointed to a set of dog tags on his desk belonging to a soldier from the 42nd Division in World War I who had died under his command. MacArthur allegedly said he was 19. I was twice his age, but felt no older that day. I wonder if he'd have lived to see a better world than the one we made. It's a rare admission of humility from a man many described as nearly impermeable to self-criticism. Perhaps in private moments he carried those ghosts with him, the same ghosts he once wrote about in the Philippines when he fretted he hadn't done enough. Controversy has trailed him like a persistent shadow, even long after his death in 1964. Critics call him vain, a glory seeker who staged photo ops and overshadowed the contributions of others. They point to his disastrous underestimation of Japanese capabilities in the Philippines, the fiasco in Korea when his drive north triggered Chinese intervention, and the heavy-handed approach to the bonus army. Supporters hail him as a master strategist whose island-hopping campaign saved thousands of lives, a builder of modern Japan who preserved peace in East Asia, and a heroic figure who always led from the front. And perhaps the truth lies in the gray space in between, as it does for most larger-than-life personalities who command in times of war. Was he flawed? Certainly. Did he inspire loyalty and hope in the men who served under him? Absolutely. Did he make choices that cost lives, whether from miscalculation or from believing he alone knew best? Undoubtedly. That is war, and that is command at the highest levels. The moral burdens are incalculable, and the scars they leave are not always as visible. Beyond the arguments, one cannot deny his lasting impact. Militarily, his early grasp of airborne and amphibious operations influenced generations of officers. He championed the idea that technological innovation coordinated strategy, and psychological warfare could spare some of the carnage of head-on assaults. In the Philippines campaign, he strategically bypassed heavily fortified areas, cutting them off from supplies. This idea of maneuver warfare became integral to American military doctrine later in the century. Politically, his role in rebuilding Japan laid the foundation for one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern history. Under MacArthur's watch, women gained suffrage, labor unions were legalized, and land reforms created a more egalitarian system. While Japanese society retained its own cultural identity, it also integrated democratic structures that persist to this day. That alone is a testament to the scale of his influence. Internationally, MacArthur's public showdown with Truman over Korea signaled an important moment in the evolving relationship between civilian leadership and military authority in the United States. Truman's decision established a precedent that, in a democracy, the generals ultimately answered to elected leaders, not the other way around. It was a valuable lesson in constitutional governance, a line that U.S. policymakers have been acutely aware of ever since. In the public imagination, MacArthur symbolizes an era when the world was on fire, and a few key personalities shaped entire theaters of war. Like Churchill in Europe, he had the rhetorical flair to capture headlines and the stern resolve to keep the public enthralled. His iconic corncob pipe, his battered cap adorned with scrambled eggs, and his steely gaze under the brim became symbols of unwavering leadership, perhaps overshadowing the vulnerable human behind them. Movies and documentaries have sometimes reduced him to caricature, the arrogant general who refused to be told no. But if we peel back the layers, we find a man shaped by near mythical stories from his father's generation, by a mother who believed he was destined for greatness, and by personal heartbreaks that rarely saw the light of day. We see a commander who carried the sorrow of lost soldiers, even as he rallied others with fierce pride. We see a strategist who aimed to crush the enemy with minimal friendly losses, but whose self-confidence sometimes crossed into stubbornness that put men at risk. And we see a statesman who governed a defeated foe with enough compassion and pragmatism to transform it into a strong ally. He remains a figure of study for anyone interested in leadership under extreme stress. His self-assured style could be a source of inspiration, galvanizing troops when morale was low. Yet that same certainty could blind him to alternative viewpoints. His devotion to men under his command was genuine, as was his unwavering sense of duty. He was not a simple man, and his career wasn't defined by a single war or a single achievement. It was a saga spanning half a century of American military and global affairs, a soldier's life from the earliest days of the 20th century to the onset of the nuclear age. What does his story teach us? Maybe that leadership demands more than tactical genius. It requires empathy and humility to understand the human cost. Maybe that unwavering vision can be a double-edged sword, propelling a leader to save entire nations, or leading him to catastrophic oversight. Perhaps there's a message about the importance of civil-military boundaries, that even the most celebrated generals serve within a broader political framework that protects democracy from one man's overreach. Or it might be a cautionary tale of how generational trauma, handed down from father to son, can shape one's destiny in complex ways. He died at 84 with a frail body but a mind that still dreamed of field commands and future campaigns. Even toward the end, he believed his perspective on Asia was indispensable, once remarking, "Asia is where the future stands waiting, and I know it as few men do." Yet the world had moved on, preparing for the space age and grappling with the new logic of nuclear deterrence. MacArthur's grand era of large-scale amphibious invasions and unstoppable offensives was passing into history. Thousands lined the streets to pay tribute, while others quietly moved on, feeling a sense that his time had come and gone. Today you can visit the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, where he is laid to rest. You'll see medals, maps, letters, and personal belongings that speak to his extraordinary life. But artifacts can only go so far in telling us who he was. In the end, he was a man in uniform, shaped by the unrelenting pressures of a half-century that saw 2 world wars and a conflict in Korea that signaled the precarious dawn of the Cold War. He embodied both the virtues and vices of that generation, steadfast courage, and almost holy devotion to duty, and a certainty in one's moral and strategic convictions that leaves little space for doubt or dissent. Perhaps the greatest tragedy or triumph, depending on one's view of his life, was that he never truly escaped the battlefield. Even in his final days, he was in spirit that young officer leading the Rainbow Division through the mud and wire of France, or the older commander walking ashore in the Philippines. Fulfilling his promise, he lived in a world where the line between personal identity and public duty was thin, almost invisible, and where the cost of command was measured in both human lives and in the private unraveling of the soul. And so we come to the quiet reflection that follows a life spent in the forge of war. From that single page of his diary, we glimpse a moment of second-guessing that never made the front pages. Here was a proud general, steeped in the discipline of centuries, haunted by the specter that perhaps he hadn't done enough, or worse, that he had done too much, pushing men beyond their limits for the sake of a grand strategy or an indelible place in history. That tension lies at the heart of Douglas MacArthur's story. His gifts were immense, his flaws equally monumental, and somewhere in the interplay of those forces lies the real lesson of his life. Leadership isn't just about standing tall when victory is assured. It's about carrying the weight of decisions that cannot be undone. It's about serving an ideal, even if you never entirely know whether that ideal is worth the price. If we measure greatness by influence, resolve, and a fierce devotion to country, MacArthur stands among the titans. If we measure it by humility, willingness to listen, and the acceptance of limits, he remains a cautionary tale. But perhaps that's exactly why he still fascinates us. In him we see the raw material of leadership laid bare, the powerful sense of destiny, and the equally powerful capacity for error. We see a man who believed in a cause enough to pledge his very soul to it. We see the inherent gamble of placing so much faith in one individual, especially in times of crisis. We see the contradictory impulses that define any real complex life: pride and sacrifice, brilliance and blindness, duty and ambition. And we feel the lingering resonance of his final words to Congress: "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Fading away may be the destiny of old soldiers, but the memory of Douglas MacArthur burns brightly in the annals of history. Not because he was perfect or universally admired, but because he was larger than life, compelling in his convictions and unwavering in his sense of purpose. He demonstrated what one man could accomplish and how perilous that ambition can be when war reshapes the world and thrusts him into the spotlight. For anyone who looks back at those tumultuous decades, his record is a reminder that wars aren't just fought with guns and bombs, but also with personalities, egos, and moral convictions. MacArthur's convictions propelled him to the heights of command and into the heart of controversy. They shaped the fate of nations and the lives of countless individuals. They sparked debates that rage long after he's gone. And in the quiet, unguarded corners of his mind, captured in that forgotten diary page, they left him wondering if his drive had cost too much. In the grand scheme, perhaps this is the most human element of his story. A man, so sure of himself in public, privately wrestling with the irrevocable nature of his decisions. That, more than any parade or medal, reminds us that behind every statue or iconic photograph stands a mortal soul, forging a path through history's storms with no map but his own conviction. Let his story stand, then, as a testament to the power and peril of leadership in wartime, a testament to how one individual can move the needle of history, for better or worse, driven by unstoppable conviction. He represents the complicated truth that heroes can also be divisive, that victories often come at a terrible cost, and that the burden of command weighs heavier than any medal on the chest. And so we leave Douglas MacArthur standing on that lonely shore, reminding us that duty can be both a guiding star and a relentless taskmaster. He salutes, the cameras click, and the tide washes around his boots. Though the war is long over, echoes of that moment carry forward, urging us to remember that behind every grand figure in history lies a fragile, questioning heart. And in that quiet recognition, we find our common humanity.